Hello, my name is Rebecca Fay and I'm Marketing Director at Natural Capital Partners. I'd like to welcome you all today to hear from one of our most valued project partners. Todd Lemons is founder of InfiniteEARTH, and he's going to give us a frank and personal account of conserving forests in Indonesia. And he's not just going to talk about the wonder of protecting orangutans, but also talk to us a little bit about some of the barriers and challenges to making a project like this sustainable over the long term. Before we get started, I just want to remind you all the webinar is scheduled to last about 45 minutes, and we will leave 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions. You are all on mute, so please use the panel on the right-hand side of your screen to submit any questions, and we will go through those at the end. So just to start off with a description of the Rimba Raya at a sort of very high level. The Rimba Raya project is a reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation project, otherwise known as RED. It's about 47,000 hectares, which is 116,000 acres, or 8 times the size of Manhattan. And you can see on the map that Rimba Raya is in dark green on the map. And is situated right next to a large number of oil palm plantations. Also, critically, the project is adjacent to the Tanjung National Park, which is a key area for biodiversity. And that means that the Rimba Raya project provides a critical connecting habitat for many species. And so with that overview, I'm delighted to now have an opportunity to talk to Todd so he can tell us more about the project. Todd, welcome, and many thanks for taking the time to talk to us today. The first question is possibly a really obvious one, which is why did you decide to set up the Rimba Raya project, and what were you hoping to achieve?
Well, thanks very much for having me, everyone, and appreciate the opportunity. And just as a clarification, the carbon accounting area is 47,000 hectares. The total project area is 65,000. So we only derive the credits from 47, but we protect a total of area of 65. So for the past 28 years, we've been creating market-based solutions to environmental problems. The dozens of projects that we have worked on have all had one common denominator, and that is that standing natural capital is grossly undervalued, and that's because there's no pricing mechanism. We price the processed derivatives of natural capital in the form of commodities, which really only represent a fraction of natural capital's total value. The idea that we deforest high conservation value, high carbon stock, biodiverse tropical forests for the production of palm oil, for example, for making cookies, cakes, and candy is a manifestation of this distortion in its intrinsic value. We have an outdated economic model in our mind where the products we consume are based on extractive and processing costs, but it doesn't include or embed the environmental externalities in the price of those goods. We believe that that's unsustainable. It's unsustainable for the manufacturer, the consumer, and of course, the environment. More profoundly, it means that really what we're doing is we're subsidizing, our children are subsidizing our consumption. By not paying for these externalities, we are creating a massive environmental debt for future generations. Our goal at InfiniteEARTH is primarily to provide companies with the tools they need to include these externalities in the price of the goods they produce through the purchase of our RED Plus credits.
Thanks, Todd. That is, obviously an inspiring sort of project to start. And can you, on a personal level, can you tell us a bit about, what were you doing before you set up Rimba Raya, and what made you start this up? What made you take on such a sort of momentous task?
Yeah, as I said, we've actually been working on market-based solutions to environmental problems for many, many years, almost 3 decades. Our first project was a project in Chile that was about 100,000 hectares that was being clear cut for pulpwood, and this was a temperate rainforest in southern Chile. Clearly, that's a bad value proposition, but we recognize that exists not because the landowner was ignorant or just plain greedy, but because market mechanisms drove that decision. So we began addressing those, trying to understand what the real drivers of these environmental transgressions, if you will, what were the real drivers behind that? And we kept coming up with the same thing. It's the economy, stupid. It was really more of an economic, issue, rather than just a sort of environmental one that stood on its own. So we've been doing that a long time, and when Kyoto came along and really excluded perhaps the single largest source of emissions, which is agricultural conversion of forests, we felt compelled to try and create the needed methodology to facilitate avoided deforestation as a mechanism.
And so when you took on this challenge, when you took on this project, what challenges did you face when you first set it up, and how did you start to overcome those?
The challenges were gargantuan, although I can't say that they weren't asked for. Well, when we decided to take up the task of creating an accounting methodology that would be able to properly measure carbon or avoided carbon emissions in an avoided deforestation scenario, we looked around the world and looked for the largest need. And the biggest need was clearly Indonesia. Indonesia at the time, this goes back to 2006 or 7, was being named as the third largest emitter, just behind the U.S. and China. But of course, it's not basically an unindustrialized country. And all of that was coming from agricultural conversion. So it was pretty obvious that if we were going to take up this task, that Indonesia and the conversion of its peat swamp forests was an area we needed to focus on. So that's what we did, and so we kind of asked for it. The challenge was that we were up against a very, very powerful and important industry in Indonesia. So when we set about identifying an area of forest that that had a high degree of additionality, meaning that it was imminently at risk of conversion, we landed upon what is now the Rimba Raya Reserve, which was this very important buffer zone to Tanjung Puting that was in the process, literally, of being deforested by a very, very large and rapacious palm oil company that was not publicly traded, so it had virtually no pressures whatsoever to conform to best practices. And so the challenge was that when we actually started with Rimba Raya, it was 101,000 hectares. That was approved at the local level. By the time we got to the provincial level, we were down to 90,000 hectares because the palm oil company kept illegally converting. And by the time we finally, perfected our legal rights at the end of a 2.5-year process at the national level, they had literally deforested an area of what, some 40,000 hectares. So that's how we ended up, with the current size of Rimba Raya being 65.
Just before, thank you, Todd, I'm going to carry on. I just have to apologise if anyone can hear the drilling that has just started in the building next door to us, so apologies for that noise, but hopefully you can all still hear us clearly. So Todd, that sort of that had a real impact on you, the sort of the politics behind the, being able to get the rights and the shrinkage of the site as a result. And as we all know, for sort of scale of forest conservation, that government engagement is really critical. So given your experience on going through that painful process, what advice would you give to other organisations on local government engagement, and what particularly has been critical in your engagement with the Indonesian government throughout this process?
I think the advice for engaging with government and communities is really the same. They want, they want how to benefit from this. We have never minimized Indonesia's right to exploit and develop its natural resources. Palm oil is a critical program for Indonesia and in its endeavors to develop. So you really, we took the challenge. We took the core belief that conservation has to pay for itself. To prove that conservation can pay and that conservation can compete, at least on a level playing field with other development opportunities. And so, when we first walked in the door and started talking about avoided deforestation and payment for, conservation, there were a lot of, they had decades of speaking to sort of the conventional NGOs and the conventional conservation approach, which was essentially, you should do this because it's the right thing to do, and you should set it aside for free and forego any government revenue, as well as community, any revenue for community. We don't believe in that approach. We walked in boldly and said, we will pay the same concession license fees that palm oil will pay. We will keep your national patrimony intact, and we will deliver significant community development benefits. Obviously, they were very skeptical, and it took us quite a long time, a period of 2 or 3 years to convince them. But if you don't walk in with that message that you're not asking them to make any sacrifices, that you believe that that this will deliver at the same, if not more, net benefits at social and economic as well as environmental, as the competing interest for this resource, you really have no chance of winning them over.
So with that, once you knew that you had to take that approach at a national sort of or a governmental level, can you also talk to us a bit about the approach that you've taken to protect the forests at a local level?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So what, once we neutralized the threat of palm oil expansion and convinced the government that this had some merit and might actually give them sort of the best of both worlds, both conservation as well as some revenues from from that potential resource, we were able to turn our attention to the second primary deforestation agent, which were the communities themselves that bordered the Rimba Raya Reserve and who have lived illegally and unsustainably from the area for decades. Historically, these communities had prospered, particularly during the 80s, from illegal logging. But once the accessible high-value timber had been depleted, they began to experience a fairly steep decline in their standard of living. By the time we showed up on the scene, they were truly living on the margins. The approach we've taken, rather than building physical fences to keep communities out, is to build social barriers to deforestation. And so to that end, 90% of what we do is really just rural community development. Our aim is to change the historic relationship these communities have had with the forest, from a purely extractive one to a regenerative one. We accomplish this through funding sustainable community enterprises. We've never believed in the welfare model by simply handing out carbon revenue checks to communities. Everything we provide to communities is, in one form or another, performance-based pay for conservation.
And Todd, why do you feel community engagement is so important? And perhaps tell us a little bit about the response, what the response has been from the local community.
Sure. Legal rights aside, I mean, these communities have never had legal rights to this area. As I said, they had lived from it informally and illegally. But legal rights aside, we have no moral authority to prevent communities' access to the reserve. Poverty and dire need is what has driven deforestation and degradation at the community level. Not greed. Without addressing basic needs, we have no hope of achieving our conservation goals. So with that approach, the response from communities has been remarkable. Not immediately. I mean, frankly, we've gone from skeptical and even in some cases hostile reception from communities to being now today accepted as part of the communities. We're invited to community events like weddings and religious celebrations and so on. They definitely view us as a partner now, and we're beginning to see the dynamic between the communities and the forest change. I suspect that in 5 years, whether carbon markets still exist or not, or whether InfiniteEARTH is still there or not, the Rimba Raya Reserve will have a really good chance of living on in perpetuity, because the communities now see this as a sustainable, regenerative, and continuously growing income source.
So could you perhaps tell us a little bit more about some of the key project activities and the impact that has delivered to the communities?
Absolutely. It's really varied, much more so than we probably anticipated. These communities are strung out along probably 100 kilometers or more of river. And surprisingly, they're quite varied, not so much culturally, but their circumstances are very, very different from the north to the south. In the north, they're very close to palm oil, and they were, actually quite pro-palm oil. In the center of the reserve, they were they were fairly prosperous, largely from illegal logging. They enjoyed their access to the forest and their traditional way of life, and were not particularly keen on going to work for palm oil. In the south, they were extremely poor. It's very remote. It's environmentally, it's not nearly as productive as the center part, and so they were actually rather desperate and had begun to have a history of pretty significant destructive horticultural practices. So our approach has been, we've had to adjust our approach to accommodate for those differences. But by and large, we employ dozens of villagers directly as field patrols, fire brigades, and guides, and we rent their canoes and their boats, and so we employ them directly as on the payroll in many capacities. More importantly, we provide funding and capacity building for community enterprises such as chicken egg production farms that we've funded, fish farms. We've created a shrimp paste production facility in the south, which is a women's co-op, and they've even developed their own consumer brand, which we are helping them get to market. Let's see what else. A large part of our reforestation efforts we've combined with community farms. So a lot of the areas, particularly in the South, as I said, have been degraded by shifting agriculture or illegal intrusion from palm oil in the past. And so we planted over, I think to date, over 300,000 trees, probably approaching 400,000, with a goal of getting, at least to 1 million by next year. All of those are indigenous cash crop, income producing species. So, those are long-term income diversification for the communities. So, and in these, of course, we encourage and insist that communities employ, an intercropping methods. So we're not producing any monoculture species, but we have a diversity of probably 20 different cash crop species that we're planting throughout, the various community areas surrounding the communities. On social services and health services, we provided potable water filtration systems to every single household up and down the reserve. And then thanks to Natural Capital Partners and Microsoft, we've also been able to provide every household with solar power. That's had a pretty significant impact. I mean, these communities are all off the grid, and I can tell from many days and weeks of personal experience that they're very long nights. The sun sets at 6 and it doesn't rise until 6. So, lighting ththese communities has really provided a, much better community interaction. They're able to, spend more of their, the dark hours sitting around the community house planning. Children are able to study, do homework in the evenings and so on. So that's been a real help, and we appreciate, the support of Natural Capital and Microsoft on that project. Really have no access to formal education, and so we're providing scholarship funds for study materials. The solar systems that I just spoke about were really helpful. The community centers typically act as religious centers, community centers, and schoolhouses. And so, having light and power in those schoolhouses has helped a lot. So, we even actually have been able to send one of the community members away to school to outside, completely outside the area to the capital city, and to be trained formally as a teacher. And so she has come back and is actually the very first formally trained teacher that any of the communities have ever had. So that's a very rewarding program as well. If we do this all successfully, the conservation part of this really should take care of itself, and does. We've seen evidence of that. If left alone, and if we provide, like I say, if we provide these growth opportunities to communities that do not have adverse impact on the forest, but on the contrary are regenerative, then we won't have to spend a lot of money on, sort of overt conservation measures. In the meantime, we support the work of Dr. Barute Galdikas, who is the founder of the Orangutan Foundation International. And I think that we're her largest single donor, which is pretty significant because every bit of that comes strictly from carbon credit revenues.
Todd, thank you. The carbon finance is obviously critical to the project. So what do you think when you're sort of thinking about businesses? Why do you feel that businesses should support the project, and what particularly would you pull out as the benefits and value to them?
The benefits and value are certainly a lot more than we're leveraging today together, and so we hope to work more closely and to really help companies leverage a much higher return on investment. All companies and all consumers, for that matter, have an environmental footprint, one that goes well beyond just carbon to biodiversity, water, and social impacts. As I said in my introduction, those externalities are not being priced into the goods and services we all consume. We very strongly believe that they should be. And we think that companies should pass those on to the consumers. This should never be just a sin tax to companies or a line item cost. Rather than view this as a cost, either to the company or the consumer, we believe that this actually represents an extraordinary opportunity to engage consumers in a much more intimate conversation about the company's values, the consumer's values, and to engage them in the process of sustainability and supply chain management. These are, Red Plus in particular, as opposed to other types of carbon credits, are extremely content-rich stories, and they can be used to create brand awareness, customer loyalty, employee engagement programs, and so on. We believe that the company's sustainability initiative should really drive the top line.
So Todd, tell me a bit about what personally, with all this work, all this commitment, the sort of business interest, the size of the project, and all those activities, what have you personally found most satisfying about working with Rimba Raya? And also, what would you do differently if you were doing it again?
Good question. Yeah. We in particular, I think, are a very results-driven organization. Everything that we've done to design Rimba Raya has been results-based. The conservation payments have to be results-based. We intend to deliver results and returns to our investors, and we expect to be able to deliver returns, to our customers. As an engineer, because I'm really an engineer more than an environmentalist, I like to measure things, actually seeing measurable positive impact in the community is very satisfying to me. As I've said already, we're beginning to see a truly systemic change in the way these communities and local governments view this resource. Not purely as an extractive, undervalued resource, but as a productive landscape. What would we do differently? If we were to develop another project today, we would certainly want to develop it in direct partnership with a corporate sponsor. There's still so much, a tremendous amount of untapped value that can be mined from a RED project, but it really requires a more intimate buy-in at the highest corporate level. By that I mean a project's goals need to be embedded in the company's DNA and synergized with their supply chain management, their marketing, their brand awareness, their HR, and so on. And you just can't get that, unless you have a closer working relationship.
Yeah, understood. So what would with that, and obviously we've got some questions about from some of our audience about the sort of business interest in the project, but given that you are focused on RED and that's the way the project is set up, what are your hopes for the project in the next 3 to 5 years, and what more would you like to achieve?
Well, I hate to repeat myself, but I can't, our goal is always that we will consider the project a success only once we've truly succeeded in permanently changing that dynamic that I keep talking about between the communities and the forest. Our goal is really to make ourselves and RED revenues irrelevant. By that I just mean to say that in order for this project to be truly sustainable in perpetuity, these community, the community's development can't be exclusively dependent directly or indirectly on red revenues. We have to transform this landscape so that, and therefore the community's view of it in a profound way, so that they are forever incentivized to continue the path of sustainable growth that we've tried to set them on. So to that end, everything we do is designed to create that sustainable community enterprise, and to promote that view of the forest as regenerative.
Fantastic. Thank you, Todd, very, very much. We've had a few questions coming in, so I'm going to sort of fire a few of them up at you, and hopefully none of them will take you by surprise too much. So obviously, part of the project, the whole concept of the project is about halting the rapid spread of deforestation for palm oil. But there is sustainable palm oil, and we know that there's organisations like RSPO which are really focused on sustainable palm oil. In your opinion, knowing on the ground what is happening around palm oil and deforestation, do you think there is a future for sustainable palm oil?
As it's currently defined, no. RSPO definitely is a step in the right direction, I suppose. It's certainly better than the lack of any standard whatsoever. The fact of the matter is, though, our population and consumption rate and the demand for palm oil specifically is growing at something like 8% a year. And if we're being honest with ourselves, there's no way we can extract an additional 8%, year over year from existing plantations. That means that there's really no such thing as this, no deforestation palm oil, or no new deforestation palm oil, or no net deforestation palm oil. Well, I guess that's the only thing that is left, is no net deforestation palm oil. Because the fact of the matter is, palm oil plantations will continue to expand in Indonesia. We're quite practical and about that understanding. So again, back to this issue that I keep bringing up, which is we just believe that the externalities have to be priced in. I would like to see sustainable palm oil more narrowly defined as, palm oil that has been quantifiably, where the biomass and biodiversity losses attributed to, the production of palm oil and the expansion of palm oil plantations has been, offset. Only then can we begin to, at least as quickly as palm oil is expanding, we need to be able to expand the conservation areas as well. So for me, that is the only true definition, practical one, of sustainable palm oil, and we hope that that's it.
Okay, great. And if we've got time, I'm going to come on to a question about other commodities. But first of all, we've had a lot of interest in the community activities. So for instance, one question about the shrimp paste. Once that shrimp paste is made, how do the entrepreneurs who are working there, how do they get that product to the market? Because clearly, there's lots you can do to make things, but it's you've got to find the markets to sell those things. So can you tell us a bit about how the communities are working on the marketing and sales side?
Sure. Well, it's actually way beyond that. It actually turns out it's not very easy to make things either. These are communities that I said were really remote. They had basically no formal education, certainly no experience in organizing themselves into, you know, a entrepreneurial business. You know, we stubbed our toe a couple of times, and you know, we had to bring in machinery, we had to bring in technical expertise for capacity building, and you know, then we had to figure out all the things we didn't even know, which were things like certification and packaging for longevity and you know, extended shelf life and so on. So we kind of had to work with the communities through that process, help them to organize themselves, you know, just the general governance of their co-op. And then, you know, only then could we actually begin working on the marketing. And so, you know, fortunately, we logistically, we are back and forth between these remote communities and, you know, larger commercial centers in the area. And so, you know, we kind of provide them this subsidized transportation and got them, you know, set up with stalls at local farmers markets in the bigger cities or towns, you know, outside the reserve. But so, you know, it's a lot of it has been, you know, their ingenuity. They came up with their own brand, their own logo. You know, they eventually did organize themselves and work out, you know, those challenges. And so we just try to play the role of facilitator wherever that has to be, and with the idea that, you know, eventually we won't be needed, and that the initiative will, you know, take on its own life, and that they'll be able to manage it completely themselves. They actually now have a representative, you know, at this larger city, at this larger market, full time now, selling, you know, with their own stand, selling these products and directly to the public. And then we've hooked them up with a couple of distributors in the much bigger cities in Bali and in Jakarta. And you know, those markets are being tested, and it's, you know, just the typical, you know, growth pains of figuring out, you know, how to match production with growing demand and so on.
Great, thank you. And so just, I think we've got time for one more question. We've just got a couple of minutes. So I'm going to ask you a big question, but annoyingly ask for a relatively short answer, which is, you know, obviously, you know, palm oil is one commodity with sustainability and sort of deforestation challenges. How do you think this approach could be replicated for other commodities that lead to deforestation? Are there things that you think could be replicated there?
100%. I mean, cocoa, you know, sugar, coffee, all of the commodities that, you know, that are particularly grown in biodiverse, you know, tropical forest areas, obviously have these externalities. They have these negative impacts. And it's really not cost prohibitive at all for those externalities, those environmental offsets to be embedded into the price of those commodities. And again, rather than it being just a loss of profits, we think that they can be used to create premium green brands or sub-brands of those products, and actually, you know, have higher profit margins and you know, higher sales revenues through brand loyalty and recognition.
Great. We look forward to hearing about your next project in, you know, in the cocoa and coffee industry, Todd. So thank you for that. We're up against our time with, you know, several more questions. So apologies to those that we haven't been able to answer now. But we will be sending round the webinar link to all the attendees, so please feel free to share that with your colleagues. And Todd, I'd like to thank you. Really, really good to speak to you, and really good to hear from you firsthand what, you know, the work you've undertaken and the challenges and the successes you've had. So we really appreciate your time, particularly on this International Day of Forests. So thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to work with you. Thank you, Todd.
On the contrary, thank you, and thanks to the audience, and of course send me any unanswered questions. Feel free to send me, and I'm happy to to answer those. So thanks again for the opportunity, everybody.
Great, thank you, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.